Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Private Anne Collishaw. Today we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the formal end of the Australian military hostilities in the Vietnam War. Australia made its first military commitment to Vietnam in 1962, deploying a small team of military advisors, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, known as the AATTV, to assist in training South Vietnamese forces. By 1965, the AATTV had expanded to 100 troops. As the US escalated its involvement, the Australian government followed suit, committing the first Australian combat troops to South Vietnam. The 1st Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, and support forces arrived in May 1965. When its tour ended in mid-1966, the Australian commitment expanded to an independent task force of two battalions with combat and logistics support. The 1st Australian Task Force established its base at Nui Dat, in the heart of the southern province of Phuoc Toi, and quickly made impressive gains. In early 1968, the task force increased in size and effectiveness with the addition of a 3rd Manoeuvre Battalion and Tank Squadron. But with casualties continuing to mount and no end in sight, public support suffered, and the war became the focal point of intense social and political dissent. By late 1970, a wind-down and withdrawal of forces was underway as the US government began to implement a policy of Vietnamisation, gradually withdrawing forces to leave the war in the hands of the South Vietnamese. The last Australian battalion left Nui Dat in November 1971. While a handful of advisors remained, in December 1972, they became the last Australian troops to come home, with their unit having seen service in South Vietnam over a decade. Australia's participation in the war was formally declared at an end when the Governor-General issued a proclamation on the 11th of January 1973. The only combat troops remaining in Vietnam were a platoon guarding the Australian Embassy in Saigon. This was withdrawn in June 1973. In early 1975, the Communists launched a major offensive in the north of South Vietnam, resulting in the fall of Saigon on the 30th of April. During April, an RAAF detachment of 7 to 8 Hercules transports flew humanitarian missions to aid civilian refugees displaced by the fighting and carried out an evacuation of Vietnamese orphans called Operation Baby Lift, before finally taking out embassy staff on the 25th of April. Some 60,000 Australians served in the war, and at its peak strength, the Australian force in Vietnam comprised elements of all 3 services. But for Australia, Vietnam was predominantly a ground war. The Army did most of the fighting and most of the dying. Australian soldiers were placed into longer periods of contact or imminent risk of contact with the enemy than perhaps any time since the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. During the course of the war, more than 3,000 Australians from the Army, Navy and Air Force were wounded, and 523 died. Today we remember those who fought in Vietnam. We pay our respects to the men and women commemorated here on the Roll of Honour and to the survivors who returned home. We warmly welcome the family of leading aircraftman Duncan Glen McNair, whose story will be told shortly. This evening we also warmly welcome Mr. Greg Hood, representing the Air Force Association, Squadron Leader Retired John Winter, representing 9 Squadron Association ACT, and the Marine Corps delegation from the United States Embassy. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. If able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem. If able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this National Memorial and Museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to leading aircraftman Duncan Glen McNair. Duncan McNair was born on the 6th of April 1943 in Monthgay, Victoria, to Arthur and Ethel McNair. The family moved to inner suburban Melbourne, where McNair was young, and he went on to attend Brunswick Technical School, where he completed his junior technical certificate. After leaving school, he became an apprentice plumber and gas fitter with Gardner and Naylor, and by 1965 was working as a driver for W.C. Cross & Sons, based in Footscray. His father had passed away in 1962, and after becoming estranged from his mother, McNair was living with a friend in Ascot Vale. During this time, he had been in a relationship with Janet McDonald, and the couple became engaged. Outside of school and work, McNair enjoyed Australian rules football, playing for the Moonee Valley Football Club. He liked playing golf, 10-pin bowling, and making mechanical repairs to motor vehicles. Soon after his 22nd birthday, McNair, seeking a better life and secure employment, applied to join the Royal Australian Air Force. His application was accepted, and he enlisted on the 23rd of August in 1965. He initially struggled, often at odds with the routine and discipline of military life. While his coursework was generally good, he was brought up on a number of charges for indiscipline. After his initial training, he was posted to the maintenance squadron at East Sale, where he worked on Vampire, Dakota, Machi aircraft. In January 1968, McNair joined the No. 37 Armament Fitters course, which he completed in May with a credit pass for his efforts. During 1968, McNair's outlook on service changed for the better. After being made aware of his responsibilities to the service, his attitude changed remarkably, although he still occasionally added to his charge sheet. His course supervisor noted the change, stating, "This airman, since completing his armament mechanics course, had improved beyond all expectations, not only in his personal outlook, but also in regards to his trade." By this time, he and Janet were married, and in 1966, they welcomed a daughter, Judy Ann, followed 2 years later by a son, Glenn. McNair posted to No. 5 Squadron, RAAF, located at Fairburn in the Australian Capital Territory, logging over 60 hours as a crewman on Iroquois helicopters and successfully completing the helicopter crewman's course. His commanding officer stated that he overcame initial nervousness to produce a very satisfactory standard. He also qualified as a driver for the squadron. A popular member of the unit, he acquired the nickname Mother. In February 1970, McNair deployed to South Vietnam, where he joined No. 9 Squadron, RAAF, at Nui Dat. Operations were constant, and McNair was soon a highly regarded member of his crew and the squadron. On the morning of the 3rd of July, McNair was part of the crew of Iroquois Alpha 2 768. Designated Albatross 01, McNair's helicopter was involved in carrying ammunition to a forward area as part of an operation being conducted by Alpha Company at 8 RAR. 2 other Albatross aircraft and 2 Bushranger gunships were involved in the operation as cover. After a short flight, Albatross 01 landed near the Courtenay rubber plantation. The flight time was quick. The helicopter landed and the ammunition was swiftly unloaded. As it flew away, its pilot noticed a suspicious person in a field adjacent to the village to the north of Nui Dat. The pilot took over the controls from the co-pilot and commenced a turn to better observe. As the helicopter banked, the pilot realised that he was too low and attempted to correct the helicopter's flight. Flying too low to recover, it struck the ground at speed. The helicopter landed hard on its skids and bounced before the belly of the aircraft struck an earth mound. The bottom of the starboard fuel cell and the electronic boost pump were torn away. Live wires from the pump ignited the fuel and the helicopter and now travelling sideways, hit the ground and rolled onto its left side. Burning fuel tore through the cabin like a wall of flame. McNair, sitting above the ruptured fuel cell, received the worst of the injuries as the fuel ignited under him. The crewman on the other side of the aircraft was thrown clear, although he too suffered burns. The two pilots, also suffering burns, managed to extract themselves through the shattered front of the helicopter. Albatross 02 was directed from its landing zone to the scene of the crash-landed helicopter. Two South Vietnamese soldiers approached the aircraft carrying McNair in a fireman's cradle. He was helped on board and placed in a sitting position. The other crewmen, despite their own burns and other injuries, got themselves to the helicopter. During the flight to Vung Tau, McNair's condition deteriorated and he was covered in a poncho. The injured airmen were flown to one Australian field hospital where McNair, suffering burns to over 75% of his body, was taken straight to the intensive care unit. The other members of the crew were stabilised and later flown by RAAF Hercules aeromedical evacuation back to Australia. On the 11th of July, McNair was flown to the US 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon in a dangerously ill condition. He had been considered for transfer to Japan, but his injuries were too severe. 2 days later, the RAAF flew Janet and her brother, Robert, to Saigon. She was able to spend several days with her husband before he passed away on the 20th of July. McNair became the first airman to die as a result of operations in South Vietnam. His remains were returned to Australia and he was laid to rest with full military honours in Springvale Botanical Cemetery in Victoria. He was 27 years old. The epitaph on his headstone reads, "Forever loved and remembered by wife Jan, children Judy Ann and Glenn." His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, along with more than 500 other Australians who died serving in the Vietnam War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. But this is one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now leading Aircraftman Duncan Glen McNair, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, in the hope of a better world.
If able, please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the growing down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.